Hello, this is Kay from KCM, and today I am making a video about, you guessed it, Scotch. Um, I had been planning on making a video this week before I did my next video on espresso because I'm enjoying doing that. I wanted to do a genuine sit down and talk about it review. So it's been a long time, or at least it's not frequent anymore, that I sit down and I actually review something. I talk about stuff, I do initial reactions. Most recently, I talked about the Alexander Murray Dalmore 15 year. Big fan of that, big fan of that. I talked about previous tastings and things like that, but today I wanted to just sit down and do a review of something, and really it's something that I have owned for a few years and kind of did an analysis of a few years ago, but didn't ever really document it. And I have quite a few bottles that fit into that category, so this is the one in question, anCnoc 22 year. I was very excited to get this bottle. It's not often I get bottles that are in the 20 plus year range just because cost is very prohibitive, and I'm a big fan of anCnoc. The anCnoc 16 year, I think, was years ago, the last time I had it, is a really good bottling for the price range. It's very much like the old Pulteney style, where you have that very citrusy kind of tropical type flavor to it with a little bit of that brininess and things like that. So I enjoyed that. This anCnoc is a little different than the 16. The anCnoc 12 is another really good whiskey. So if you're looking for, when people ask me what's a good low budget single malt Scotch to get into, I generally recommend something like anCnoc 12, Old Pulteney 12, Glen Grant 12, things like that. They're easy openers. They're not the ultra hyped or ultra common Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, Macallan, etc., etc. Yeah, so those are some whiskeys that I really like to recommend for people who are just trying out Scotch or single malt and want to buy something. The other thing is Speyburn. That's another one I like to recommend. Anyway, anCnoc is on that list. That's the point. So, with that said, this is the 22 year. It's 46% alcohol by volume. It's natural color, non-chill filtered. Those are things we like. Why do we like them? Because colorant is nothing more than a means of deceiving us. Doesn't help with flavor, doesn't help with content. In fact, it's more probably detracts from those elements. Chill filtration. A reason we don't like chill filtration is pretty much the same thing. It's more a means of making the whiskey seem appealing, and less so about actually contributing to the whiskey's character. And it's commonly, I don't want to say believed, it's apparent that when you chill filter something, you take something away from the whiskey. And what I've mostly heard and noticed is that becomes apparent in the finish. Why do they do it? So chill filtration is a means of preventing a whiskey from getting cloudy. With Scotch, they call it Scotch mist, which is basically when you take a whiskey at a higher proof and it has impurities. And when I say impurities, that sounds negative. It's not. It's just sediment. It's things in the whiskey that look unappealing. If you add water to it, it will fog up. So people in the marketing world decided that wasn't desirable. So they started chill filtering it. It's a means of preventing that from happening. But we don't care because we're not superficial. Anyway, other than that, it is It doesn't say, but very evidently it has sherry cask elements to it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Um, a little bit about anCnoc, if you don't know, they're a Highland distillery, and it's actually called Knock Do Distillery, which, yep, which is not to be confused with Knock Can Do. There are two distilleries that sound very similar, but are actually different, and I'm not sure how to pronounce the other one, but don't be confused. Knock Do Distillery makes anCnoc whiskey. Why is it different? Branding. I think that's what I remember out of it. Anyway, so we're going to pour a nice pour of this. I will qualify as I talk about this whiskey that, again, I said, and you've already seen a couple times, but this whiskey's kind of at the end of its life. I've said before that I've had this whiskey for several years, so that should come into consideration when we talk about it. For those who aren't aware, a whiskey doesn't quite oxidize like a wine, and it doesn't age like things like beer and wine. As it sits in the bottle, it doesn't improve with age or whatever. It doesn't spoil like wine does. And my whiskey tends to stay in a fairly cool and low sun environment, so it's not a huge concern of it aging rapidly or deteriorating. However, the more the whiskey empties the bottle, the less whiskey's in the bottle, the more it's going to deteriorate, and there will be some effect. So I preface that in case you say, well, that's not a very fair review of anCnoc. Well, I've had this whiskey for a long time, and I've tried it a lot of times, so I have a pretty good idea of where I stand with it. But again, I've never documented those feelings. Unfortunately, it's going to be hard to do reviews with my nose being plugged up, and I don't know why it is, but. And you might be asking yourself, are you going to edit this out? No. Absolutely not. No. That would take time. No. Okay. anCnoc 22. Let's give it some consideration. Huh? Smells like snot. No. Okay, right off the bat. So anCnoc 22. The sherry element of it is very strong. It's different types of sherry have kind of different flavor profiles to them. Oloroso sherry is kind of a nuttier sherry, like an Aneros or a PX sherry would be a little more sweet. This has kind of like an Amoroso. It's just not Oloroso's type smelling. It's very fragrant, very fruity, well-rounded. There's kind of a floral note to it. You get the maltiness, all of that, and the smell right off the bat is really well-rounded. So I did talk a little bit about the citrus, like it's like a sweet candied orange type smell. That is in there. That is prevalent. It's not the same as when you get the anCnoc 16, but you can tell it's the same spirit. It's got the same mojo to it. And I'm not going to go through and list all the notes, but yeah. So it's pretty dry off the palate. It smells a lot sweeter than it tastes. And that's where there is a bit of nuttiness on the actual body of the whiskey. And that's complemented with some kind of tart and sweet notes, maybe some cherry in there, some citrus, some orange. Um, it does have a little bit of that saltiness to it. It's very subtle. The maltiness is in, and then you get that kind of like red wine, deep, raisiny, sherry type flavor along with it. Um, it's reasonably complex. It does taste like an older whiskey, and it kind of it manages that balance really well. If you hear snoring, my dog is laying right there and she's snoring. I know my reviews are just a mess, but I can't help it. My dog snores. Yeah, it is quite it's quite interesting. There are some nice spices in there. Um, oh gosh, if I were to start go through and trying to list them, I do try to avoid going too in depth in terms of what I think the tasting notes are, because and I've talked about this in past videos, but I don't know how beneficial that is to people as much as the experience. So the experience, kind of focusing in on that, you do get something that's very well balanced. It does touch a lot of different flavor profiles, which I like in a whiskey. I like a whiskey that can throw a lot of stuff in there, but still keep it sensible. And I think this anCnoc 22 does that really well. It tastes like something that's well put together and sensible. So naturally, we're going to add some water in. We're not going to do too much in this case because, one, it's 46% alcohol by volume. That's a great bottling strength for just a non-cast strength whiskey. So it's you can go with the water, but you don't need to be abundant with it necessarily. The other thing is, and this is another thing I've talked about before, but older whiskeys are a little more fragile when it comes to adding water. So if you're drinking a 20-plus-year-old whiskey, you might want to be a little more conservative. Likely it's also a more expensive whiskey. So when you kill a whiskey, if you've ever been to a tasting or tried experimenting with a whiskey, you can tell where that threshold is, where it just kind of loses all of its fight. All the tenacity's gone, and you're just like, this is dead. I always encourage people when they're at tastings or doing stuff, go ahead, kind of like be daring, play on the side of danger. But when it comes to older whiskeys, and especially when it's your own bottle, you might choose to be a little more conservative, especially if you have more time. And it's not often that we sit down and actually take time with our drinks. So I would encourage you to do that. The maltiness, the spice, the sherry kind of falls in the backdrop. It becomes part of the base a little more, and some of these other elements of it start to blossom out as you add water. It is a really, really well blended, well rounded whiskey. So cutting to the chase, in talking about what this whiskey is, it is not the most complex whiskey in the world. I gotta be honest. If I were to sit down and go back to this, only because it's a recent topic of conversation, I've had this whiskey twice now. Mostly because I was very curious to get a second opinion on it. But this whiskey really delves into complexity, and it really does a good job, not just with balance, but also with making sure that it could handle the complexity and deliver it in a really attractive and sensible manner. anCnoc 22 is everything you'd want out of a good whiskey. It really is a good whiskey. But, when you start factoring in price tag and things like that, it does kind of fall into the average category. It's not the most impressive whiskey in the world. Is it good? Yes. Is it unique? Yeah. And is it complex? Yes, it is. But there, when I look at the Octomore or the Dalmore or, some of my other favorites, the old Pulteney 17, which they discontinued, but I do have a bottle of. It was a wedding present for my whiskey club. This whiskey doesn't deliver as well as those. It doesn't diversify all of those flavors as well, and that is a shortcoming of it. Now you might say, okay, Kay, what would you buy it again? And that's always a really challenging question for me, because in some sense, when I've experienced a whiskey, I want to move on. And one of the glorious things about independent bottlers is you're always getting a new experience, even if it's not always the same or the best or as good as before. But when you open a new bottle of whiskey, that's the excitement in some sense for me, especially when you're spending a lot of money. If I just want to have a good drink, I can do that with any number of things. So would I buy it again? In a sense, now I don't remember exactly what I paid for this, but I think it might have been around $150. anCnoc is not the creme de la creme of whiskeys in terms of like brand name and things like that. So you can typically buy them for what is normally a bargain price. But at $150, there are whiskeys that outperform this in the same class. Maybe they don't offer the exact same profile. I would say if you haven't tried it and you're interested in that kind of profile of whiskey, something that does have that kind of drier, sherry-esque type flavor with some good spices and some interesting characteristics, and you're willing to shell out that kind of money, I think anCnoc 22 is actually a pretty decent offering. It's just not the best out there. And I think that's where you could put a number out there. You could say, okay, it's, 8.25. That's probably what I would give this. 8.25, 8.5. And it is getting a ding in a sense because it is a more expensive whiskey. And I always look to see more complexity, more engagement out of a whiskey when I pay more money. That's why I pay more money. Period. I don't care about the age necessarily. It could be a 3-year-old whiskey at $150. That is a ripoff. So there's some puts and takes there. But if that 3-year-old whiskey is more complex and more engaging than a 22-year-old whiskey, then I guess in a sense it's not. It does make sense. It's just hard to justify why it would cost that much. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that. I hope that's beneficial for anybody who wants to go out there and try it. For the most part, I don't think any of my audience is particularly interested in one single bottle of $150 single malt scotch. So, in another sense, I hope that you just kind of gleaned something out of this in terms of what can you expect when you go out there and buy whiskey. And if you're looking to try something like anCnoc 12-year, it's like $45. That is a reasonable threshold for single malt whiskey. Don't buy single malt whiskey to mix it with Coke, okay? Go out and buy Kirkland Scotch or buy Johnny Walker or Dewar's or Grant's, preferably Grant's, that's the best. Don't go out and buy nice whiskey for that. Buy nice whiskey to drink nice whiskey like it's meant to be drank, because Otherwise, you're wasting your money on quality that doesn't matter. You know, I don't know. Especially nowadays, money's important. Thank you again for watching. If you like this or you have questions or comments or you want to see something different, let me know. Cheers.